We are here with the co-hosts of Blowback, and given the fact that you're experts on the topic, let's talk about the blowback that can possibly happen as a result of this new phase of U.S. imperialism in Latin America, these efforts to assert a new kind of dominance over the region. What could this mean for the peoples of the world and the peoples of the United States in particular in this notion of potential blowback? We'll start with you, Noah.
Sure. I think that people should be wary and that people should see what the United States government does to other countries, and they should take note of the freedom and flexibility and seeming ease with which the American government is willing to do that damage to its own people.
What about you, Brendan?
I agree with that. I think the world at large should be on guard. But what we saw here just the past couple of days is I think the United States is underestimating how coordinated and united other parts of the world, especially Latin America, can be. At a period in which U.S. empire probably believes itself to be getting a second wind, but is, to a lot of people, acting out of desperation, which certainly seems to be why it's getting even nastier and even more brazen.
So given the fact you guys have done incredible amount of research in terms of past experiences with direct U.S. intervention, U.S. imperialism in the region, what can you say in terms of drawing from that research that you've done about what the response should be from the peoples, from resistance movements, from progressive governments, given this new kind of more vulgar phase of U.S. imperialism?
Well, I wouldn't want to tell anyone outside of America what to do, being from the Yankee empire itself. But I think that the Americans can expect that cases that we've studied, such as the Cuban Revolution and its aftermath, not just the 1959, but the decades and decades that have followed, there's incredibly stubborn resistance to attempts to overthrow or co-opt or make deals, which I think especially the Trump administration is banking on. I think with Venezuela, they're hoping that they can simply just decapitate maybe the most visible leadership there and make a deal. We'll see if that pans out. With Cuba, I'd be amazed if they could pull that off or even get close to any kind of dialogue like that. We've heard from several Cuban participants in this event that kind of gangsterismo is not going to fly with the leadership of Cuba, certainly not the people of Cuba. And I would say the same here in Colombia. So it is a more flagrant and, as I said, brazen attempt to topple democratically elected governments and popular governments in Latin America. But this mafioso approach, I don't think has a lot of chance here, because, as you say, the resistance movements and the popular movements in this region have been here before. They've seen administrations before this one try more militant things, sleazier things. They're ready for this kind of thing, in my estimation.
What about you, Noah? Do you think there's much future to this gunboat diplomacy style of conducting foreign policy that we're witnessing from the White House right now?
I've given up on my future telling business, so I won't be in the business of making predictions. But what I will say is that the gunboat diplomacy of this generation does not seem to be coming from, as Brendan sort of identified, a position of great strength. It's, if anything, a sign of a weakening of internal will on the part of the United States to be able to enforce its hegemony through other more conventional means, through the kinds of coercion that we've seen the United States and allied powers use on enemy states for the last half century and more. Where I believe that perhaps now, what does the fact that this gunboat diplomacy comes from weakness suggest? I believe that I believe that it is incumbent on Americans and North Americans and people who are in the belly of the beasts of these Western governments to take seriously what their governments are doing abroad, and take seriously the idea that, yes, just because we're in decline, yes, just because this current phase of reaction as explosively violent as it is, but perhaps maybe not so long lasting in its violence, that's no reason to slack off. And if anything, it should be the basis for a renewed commitment to principles of international solidarity, democracy, and respect for the sovereignty of other nations.
Now, of course, we know that very famous adage that fascism is imperialism come home. And we've seen these really interesting scenes where, in the context of this kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro happening really close to this assassination that ICE carried out against Rene Good. And obviously we know there's been yet another case now. What do you see in terms of bringing things back closer to home about that potential for a unity of struggles, of understanding that the struggles abroad are indeed connected? We've already seen inklings of it, but what do you make of that in terms of the conditions on the ground inside of the United States for more of these kinds of, consciousness building around these shared struggles?
I would say the challenge that I would issue to Americans on that front is to think about the extent to which so much of what you see in terms of imagery and media on the internet about atrocities and tragedies in other countries, and to consider that, the death of these two, objectively heroic, martyrs they've become for the cause of resisting the psycho-American authoritarianism, nativism, fascism, whatever you want to call it, or whichever way you want to address it. I think it would behoove us to remind that, we inflict this kind of pain and we inflict this kind of terror, and we support this terror being inflicted on governments and on peoples around the world. And that it's, for when we see a Rene Good and when we see an Alex Preddy in our country, in the United States, it should remind us that there are many, many people like that who never get the chance, or who are cut down in their prime just as much in other countries by the truckload. And we should always, as ever, remind ourselves that, yes, even though they're, as people like to talk about the imperial boomerang, or as it were, blowback in the United States. But the reality is that the blowback and the pain that the American state deals out is most felt by people in other countries.
That's right. Your thoughts?
I would echo everything Noah said. And if there's any possibility that Americans' eyes can be opened to the fact that, I'm not the first person to point this out, but what we're thinking of, and what the Canadian leader said the other day, Carney, said is the death of the liberal order, or whatever kind of comforting idea of international law and respect for sovereignty, that's dying right now. With regard to Europe, I don't even know if you could date it this recently, but that began with Gaza. And that began under the Biden administration. So I don't want to confuse things too much. We are where we are now with Trump. But if Americans can get down with the idea that this is going on all over the world with their tacit support, with my tacit support, my tax dollars, their tax dollars, and see, not to put it too grimly, but how horrifying it feels to be at the other end of that kind of violence and that kind of brute force, then some good may be able to come from what is now transpiring inside of America, because it's been transpiring all across the world with, again, our supposed democratic approval, given that we elect these people. And maybe it's about time, maybe it is going to be the time that era of American acceptance of our foreign policy can start to wobble and maybe collapse.
Excellent. And a plug for your show. Please tell our viewers and listeners where they can find out.
Blowback Podcast, Season 6, airing right now. The story of Angola and the Cuban intervention, available wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in, new episodes every Monday.
Excellent. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, guys.